Hello and welcome to Below the Hospital. I'm your host, Garland-Rhea Grisby Sr., Sterile Processing Manager at Sutter Health, CPMC. In this podcast, I ask what some might consider hard questions, but what I think are informative questions about the sterile processing profession. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with on the show someone who is no stranger to SPD or the SPD world. We have Alex Hilliker. Alex is Executive Vice President at ChemDAQ, a manufacturer of sensory technology that assists with chemical monitoring. Alex, welcome to the show.
Garland, thanks so much for having me. I was thinking about getting ready to come on and have this conversation with you, and I thought back to my first AAMI meeting, I think 16 or 17 years ago at this point. I was an intern, fresh out of college, and I thought, man, this is so cool, how the sausage gets made and everybody coming together to make these recommendations and standards. So it's kind of a full circle moment for me. It's awesome to be here.
Nice. Definitely appreciate that background as an intern. Wow. And look at you now.
Yeah, there you go.
So let's dive right in here. So let's set the stage. Now, what would you say are some of the major threats to worker safety in SPD?
It'll be no surprise to listeners that have heard me talk before or know my background, but overexposure to hazardous chemicals in SPD, specifically sterilants and high-level disinfectants, is something that I don't think it's talked about enough. Let's talk about why, right? Why do people not talk about this as much? And I think part of it has to do with the transition away from ethylene oxide, coming up on 30 years ago. When people used ETO, and I know in a recent podcast I listened to, you talked about ETO quite a bit, Garland. People looked at ETO as the boogeyman, right? All of the standards and regulations that came out, and with good reason, of course. And as all of the hospitals really around the country have transitioned away from ethylene oxide in favor of low temperature sterilization with hydrogen peroxide, some of that healthy respect for the chemicals, I would say, has diminished a little bit. And I like to remind people that, even though we're using different chemicals, we've got the same goal. And the same could be said with the transition away from glutaraldehyde as a high-level disinfectant to peracetic acid, for example. We're using a different chemical, but we're still trying to kill all the bad stuff, still trying to kill the pathogens, we're still trying to kill the bugs. And so let's talk about how we should best minimize and mitigate exposure to ourselves as humans, because we're made up of similar cells.
I appreciate you bringing that out because yes, folks will say, well, this is safer, but at the end of the day, it's still trying to kill something. So it is definitely, worth noting. So I appreciate you bringing that out. You mentioned being an intern when you first attended an AAMI meeting. So let's talk about worker safety as it's discussed in the updated ANSI AAMI ST58.
I'm an AAMI ST58 super fan. I think the work that the technical committee did, to prep for and release the 2024 version was outstanding. And I think a key part of the 2024 update, really the spirit of a lot of those changes and updates that were made, is technician safety when working around chemical sterilants and high-level disinfectants. There are new annexes, for example, for working with peracetic acid solutions, for working with vaporized hydrogen peroxide sterilization. There's a new appendix for gas and vapor monitoring. And really what this updated version of ST58 covers is, of course, the effective use of those chemicals, but also safety considerations and health effects of overexposure to those chemicals. The latest occupational exposure limits, which we'll talk about, I think, a little bit later in this conversation as well. PPE recommendations and requirements, ventilation, and also the importance and the key role that monitoring plays in protecting you and your staff when you're working around these chemicals. And so the standard specifically points to this for a few reasons. And I'd like to mention high level, Garland, the health effects of overexposure to things like peracetic acid and hydrogen peroxide, because these are oxidizing chemicals. The way that they work is they break down the cell wall and they attack the DNA and they kill the cell. That's how they kill the pathogens. And I mentioned earlier, we're made up of cells as well. So we want to minimize to the greatest extent possible what we're exposed to. Because it's not just the irritation concerns, of course. People that have worked around hydrogen peroxide and peracetic acid, I'm sure are at least somewhat familiar with being overexposed and what that might feel like. Peracetic acid, for example, there's a strong odor. If you've worked around PAA, you've worked around PAA.
Yes.
But some people don't know that peracetic acid exposure, repeat exposure, has been linked to things like occupational asthma. It's also a sensitizer, as is glutaraldehyde, which PAA largely replaced, which means that with prolonged exposure, you can actually trigger a more significant response to that particular chemical. And then on the other side, on the low temperature sterilization side, hydrogen peroxide, also an oxidant, also an irritant. And there's a really interesting study that came out in JAMA a couple of years ago that talked about the increased risk of physician-diagnosed COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, followed 75,000 nurses for several years, I believe. And hydrogen peroxide was on the list of chemicals that repeated exposure was linked to COPD diagnosis, while also correcting for lifestyle factors like smoking and things like that. So, I think that when we talk about the updates to ST58, that helps, I think, shed a little bit of color and light on why the committee decided to put in some of these additional pieces of information about how we can best keep our team members protected.
Man, I appreciate that. Wish some of these documents were out a long time ago. When I used to work around or work with glutaraldehyde or Sidex or whatever you want to call it, in a very small room with no ventilation whatsoever, right?
Probably in an open bin, right, Garland? Just kind of fumes
Oh
just going
yeah.
out into the department.
Oh yeah. And then we got these other units that had, exhaust systems, but it still didn't do anything. So now with that, and in conversations that you had with folks, are folks in the field aware that the standard has been updated, that ST58 has been updated, and that it includes new material on worker safety and monitor?
It's getting there, Garland. I would say the first 6 months or so, it was ST58. What's that standard again? Because sometimes I say that ST58 gets a little lost in the sauce.
It
Sometimes,
does.
it's not 71 or 79. It's not 91.
Right.
But people will say, "Oh, that's the one for chemical sterilization and high-level disinfection." Right? When was that updated? End of 2024. So we're now coming up, believe it or not, on 2 years this fall of when that was updated. And so I think that people are coming around to it. One of the questions that I get sometimes is, well, why did ST58, why did the committee make some of these updates really centered around worker safety to the point of your question, Garland? And there's really sort of three pieces of information or rationale, I should say, that the standard puts out that helps kind of cover why these updates were made and why some of the recommendations in there were made. And the first is that equipment sometimes can and sometimes does fail, right? These are machines. After all, this is technology. Things break. I always say in these types of conversations, for the record, that the manufacturers of low temperature sterilizers and AERs, automated endoscope reprocessors, of course, longevity and reliability and worker safety is a priority. But machines are machines, right? Cars break down, washing machines break down, things happen. The second piece of rationale that the committee gives and that the standard gives is that odor is not a reliable indicator of the safe presence of either peracetic acid or hydrogen peroxide. This is
Right.
something we hear all the time, of course, that I can smell if I have a problem.
Right.
You just talked about it, right? With the glutaraldehyde fumes. Peracetic acid, very, very strong, pungent odor, but you can't really tell what level it's at. Everybody has a different level of sensitivity to that particular chemical as well. Hydrogen peroxide, a lot of people don't realize or remember that it's largely odorless at low concentrations.
Right.
And so, we can't really rely on that sense of smell to keep us safe. And then the third piece of rationale that AAMI gives is that the technology exists to be able to better protect our team members. There's a lot of different types of monitoring technology that are out there that we can talk about. but there's monitoring that's available, reliable, accurate, and I think is a really helpful tool when we talk about awareness of this standard and the recommendations that are made within it.
Most definitely. And in our field, we need all of the tools that are available. It's some of these that we wish we had before. I remember some time ago in first having an initial conversation with another organization that I worked with and ChemDAQ. There was a issue with a chemical exposure in a sister facility, and this would have come in very handy. And then after that, they got it, and then when another one kicked up, they caught it. So these tools are definitely important to have.
Yeah,
So
and
so
Garland, could I jump in on that point right there, actually? Because
yep,
this is a key point, I think, and that's that we're all on the same team when it comes to chemical safety in the department. And I think that has evolved quite a bit over the
yep,
years as well. I think there used to kind of be a tension, if you will, between, it's this person's machine or this company's
yep, yep.
machine and this company's chemical, and then there's the monitoring. One of the things that ST58 says very directly is that that's the way of the past, man, right?
Yep.
Like we are all on the same team. You should talk to the chemical providers, the equipment manufacturers, the gas monitoring manufacturers, and it's a team effort when it comes to safety. And so I'm glad that you brought that point up because I think that's a really important piece for people to remember.
Definitely. So that being the case, what is the importance of gas and chemical vapor monitoring to worker safety and SPD? Why is it important?
Yeah, quite simply, I always I say it's a little bit of a joke, but I say that our noses are not calibrated in parts per million, right? So, when you're working around these chemicals, I'll take hydrogen peroxide I mentioned is largely odorless at low concentrations, and so if you're not monitoring for it in some form or fashion, those exposure events can quite realistically be missed, right? And parasitic acid has that opposite problem where you can smell it, but we tend to go nose blind to things that we're around every day. It's this phenomenon called olfactory fatigue. And for
Yes.
people that have young kids in sports like I do, if you walk into a locker room after a practice and you're overwhelmed with the stink from the kids' equipment, and they don't notice it, right? Because they're working or they're playing around it every day. It's their equipment, it's their locker room. That's what olfactory fatigue is. And so the importance of gas and vapor monitoring is that it's a flashlight, right? It shines a light in the darkness of chemical exposure. It gives you real-time visibility. Annex P in ST58 gives a really helpful description of the ideal vapor monitor. So I'd encourage listeners after this show to take a look at that because it talks about the importance of continuous and instantaneous readings, data logging, accuracy and reliability, of course, and ease of use. I think it's important to note that SPD technicians and managers are not vapor monitoring experts. And so we should not expect them to be as such. And so the tools that are being used by folks working in the department should not require any specific technical training. They should be pretty obvious in terms of what's safe, what's unsafe.
Thank you for that. Because there's a lot of expectations that folks have for SPD checks. Like you should do it all.
Hey,
No,
y'all have
no,
enough on,
that,
on your plate, Garland. I think we should make it as easy as possible for you.
and we appreciate that. So during your career, have you encountered any misconceptions about chemicals commonly used in SPD?
Oh, all the time. I can give you a couple of examples. I think, one thing we hear a lot, of course, and that's discussed a lot is it's just hydrogen peroxide, right? Hydrogen peroxide is a safe chemical, sort of in quotes. And while we've come a long way from ethylene oxide, of course, like we talked about at the beginning of this episode, I think most people have this association of hydrogen peroxide with the brown bottle in the drugstore
Yeah, yeah.
that they put on their cuts and scrapes. They think, oh, hydrogen peroxide's in laundry detergent and shampoos and soaps and household cleaners, and that's all true. What people don't realize, or the misconception that they may have, is that that's typically a 3% concentration of hydrogen peroxide, which is very, very
Hmm.
small. And when we're talking about the inside of a low temperature sterilizer that uses vaporized hydrogen peroxide, we're talking 50, 60, 70% concentration of hydrogen peroxide. That's not the same thing that's in your toothpaste, right? To help
Right.
whiten your teeth. And so having that healthy respect for the chemical, and I worked with somebody in the past that said, it's all about the concentration, it's all about the dose, right? And so it's important to remember that. And I think that the other thing that comes up in terms of a misconception, Garland, is this perception that we transitioned away from chemicals like ethylene oxide and glutaraldehyde in favor of hydrogen peroxide and peracetic acid for primarily safety reasons. What most people don't really think about or realize is that while safety was absolutely a part of that equation, it was also cycle time. Ethylene oxide, when people that are listening, I'm sure some have worked in departments that used ETO years ago. This was 8, 10, 12 hours per
Yep.
cycle. It was an
Yep.
overnight
Yep.
cycle because of the aeration phase and preconditioning and things like that. And low temperature sterilizers now with vaporized hydrogen peroxide, we're talking less than 30 minutes, right? I mean, that's a huge, huge increase in efficiency. That's more instruments reprocessed, more
Yep.
patients served, more cycles completed, more throughput for the department. Same can be said with automated endoscope reprocessors for peracetic acid. And so I think that, when people think about, I like to say that people are trained on process, not safety sometimes. And so I think that keeping those things in mind, going back to the theme of why do we use the chemicals we use, why do we use the equipment that we use, ultimately the aim is patient safety. Of course, that's why SPD exists. But let's take into consideration some of those other risks that may be involved and those trade-offs that we make to be able to best protect and serve the patient.
Very, very, very important parts. And I always tell folks, I will tell you the rationale. I can teach you to do something, but when you understand the why behind what you're doing, then you better equip for everything else that you have going on in our world.
No doubt.
So now it may seem like an obvious answer, but what's the importance of identifying exposure risk before exposures happen, and also some common practices that reduce the exposure risk?
Yeah, I think that I'll steal a line from a colleague of mine again, which is if you don't have to breathe it, don't. Right? It's a common sense approach to working around any chemical in really any part of life. If you don't have to breathe in, if you don't have to be exposed to it, don't. Because of those health considerations that we talked about, both for long-term exposure, repeated exposure, but also acute exposure as well. If you get exposed to enough hydrogen peroxide or peracetic acid, you're going to have a bad day. These are very irritating chemicals, even at relatively low concentrations. And so, what can people do, to the second part of your question, Garland, about what are some common practices to reduce that risk? Of course, appropriate personal protective equipment, PPE, appropriate ventilation. You mentioned your experience with glutaraldehyde. Unfortunately, and listeners will know exactly what I'm talking about. A lot of endoscope reprocessing rooms, AER rooms, Medivata rooms, whatever people tend to call them, they're in glorified closets, right? Let's be honest. I'll be direct
Yeah.
on the Below the Hospital podcast. I think that it's important to remember that ventilation is critical when working around these chemicals. That 10 air exchanges per hour is important to remember. And when we think about more practical things that people can do when working around low temperature sterilizers, for example, remember that when you open the door of that sterilizer at the end of a cycle, that's a potential for an acute exposure event, we call it. And
Yep.
so, some facilities that we work with, of course, will crack the door. And if they have a monitoring system on the sterilizer for worker safety, they'll take a look at the sensor and the monitor and see what the levels may or may not be when they open the door. They might step away and let the machine vent and go work on something else for a couple of minutes. Or if they see, the levels being low or zero, they've got clearance to reach in and remove that tray. Sometimes we see when working with AERs that the disinfection cycle, you can see an elevated level of of peracetic acid, for example. You can step out during those few minutes and then come back in. So there's really practical things that you can do, but the common thread there is you've got to have the data to be able to inform those types of decisions. And that's a lot of what Accreditation 360 from Joint Commission is getting at, of using data to drive those decisions within the department and making those decisions each and every day about how to increase your safety, your efficiency, and your operational resilience.
Yes, definitely. So I'll ask this final question, right? Is there anything that you would recommend that SPD leaders today should do to ensure workplace safety in their sterile processing departments? You mentioned just like a couple of things, as far as practical things, but what recommendations do you have?
The most important thing, Garland, and everybody listening, is awareness and education. So one thing I talk about a lot is understanding where we are with occupational exposure limits. And again, being very candid about this on this particular podcast. In a lot of ways, I argue we're dealing with the wrong framework when it comes to occupational exposure limits with these particular chemicals. And let me tell you what I mean by that. If you go to OSHA's website right now and look up the permissible exposure limits for hydrogen peroxide, pick your chemical, there's a big disclaimer on the front page of OSHA's website for permissible exposure limits that says OSHA recognizes that many of its permissible exposure limits are outdated and inadequate for the protection of worker health. That doesn't give me a whole lot of reassurance,
Wow.
right? And when we're talking about hydrogen peroxide and why I say it's the wrong framework, for example, the permissible exposure limit for hydrogen peroxide of 1 part per million, which is the same as ethylene oxide, by the way, that's an 8-hour time-weighted average. That was adopted by OSHA in 1971 and has not been updated since. And that's based on data and research from the 1950s and the 1960s.
Right.
This is 20-some years, 25 years before low-temperature sterilization with hydrogen peroxide even existed. And so I really encourage people to understand that and look to, we often think about the United States informing the rest of the world on the culture of safety in the department. I encourage people to take that reverse view as well and see what other countries around the world are doing with short-term exposure limits, for example, which are 15-minute time-weighted averages. Peak limits, Australia is introducing a peak limit for peracetic acid exposure of 0.4 parts per million that goes live December of this year. Long-winded answer to your question, Garland, but I think that the awareness and the education of what's going on leads to a healthier respect for these chemicals. ST58 is a wonderful resource for how to ensure the safe and effective use of these chemicals. And knowing what those exposure levels are in real time, simply cannot be overstated enough.
Yeah, and you know what? Awareness and education, very important. I talk about that all the time. I remember some years ago, I had some exposure studies done with the chemicals that we were using. And folks were like, what are you guys trying to figure out? And I said, everything. I said, I'm trying to figure out what I'm exposing my staff to and how much and for how long, and the different things that we need to do. And we did that study for a few days, and then we had it done in another facility for a few days. We had it done in another one of my departments, so that we can see the struggles that each of us had as far as our exposures and where we were and how they differ based on the room. And like you said, a glorified closet, or do you have a room that is truly set up for the task that we're supposed to be doing in there, which is working around chemicals?
Well said, Garland. And I think that, as everything continues to evolve, we're going to continue to create safer and more effective and efficient departments for everybody. And I think that's a very worthwhile and attainable goal.
Yes, yes. Well, Alex, I want to thank you for being on the show. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule, your mountain of emails that you got to get back to. And we definitely look forward to having you on the show again.
Thanks, Garland. Likewise.
So, folks, as usual, I hope this episode has been useful. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. If you want to support the podcast, you can find us at Below the Hospital on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, and AAMI.org. Until then, see you when I see you.